Thank you, Mr Chair, and it's with great pleasure that we finally come to the committee stage of the Residential Tenancies Amendment Bill. This bill has been a long time in its passage through the House since it was reported back from Select Committee in the middle of last year, in about September last year, I think, and it's very pleasing that we're finally seeing some action on passing this piece of legislation. Mr Chair, Labor has put up a number of SOPs in the committee stage. This is a bill that we do support. It was a Labor Party piece of legislation to start off with. Unfortunately, the Minister saw fit to water down the protections for tenants under this piece of legislation, so I've moved a number of SOPs in my name in an attempt to address that watering down and to try and restore some of the protections that Labor saw fit to award to tenants under the Residential Tenancies Amendment Bill. It's fair to say, Mr Chair, as a background, that tenants in New Zealand do not enjoy an enormous amount of protection compared to tenants in other countries around the world that we compare ourselves to. Most other OECD countries have secure tenancies. New Zealand does not have that. What this means is that any tenant in New Zealand can be evicted on 90 days' notice for absolutely no reason at all. That does not provide security for families in New Zealand. In saying that, I acknowledge that the situation in New Zealand is very different from, for example, Europe, where you have a large number of corporate landlords as opposed to mum and dad landlords. But I feel that the piece of legislation that Labor had originally put forward provided a number of protections for tenants which did not need to be removed when you consider that the balance is already heavily weighted towards the landlord in New Zealand compared to other countries. And I don't hold out much hope that the government will be supporting them, because I fear some of these arguments have already been had and lost. But there is one particular SOP which is on a new issue that I hope the government will support, but certainly Labor will be arguing very strongly that the SOPs that have been put up in my name in this committee stage should indeed be supported. The first SOP in my name that I want to speak to is regarding the issue of letting fees. Now, in the piece of legislation that Labor had put up, in Labor's Residential Tenancies Amendment Bill, we prohibited the charging of letting fees to tenants. So, Mr Chair, this is where a tenant goes into a letting agency in order to find a property to rent. A landlord has engaged a letting agency to market their property to prospective tenants. And then when a tenant finds a property that they wish to rent, the letting agency charges that tenant usually a week's rent, sometimes more, but usually a week's rent for that service. Well, Labor thought that that was particularly unfair. It's hard enough at the moment, especially for tenants to get into the private rental market without putting up another barrier in front of them. And when you consider that rents are likely to rise as a result of taxation changes in the budget, this is a barrier for tenants that is not needed and not warranted. And I make the comparison, Mr Chair, with real estate agents. For example, when someone wants to sell their house and they engage a real estate agent to market that house for them to prospective buyers, it is the vendor that pays the charges or the commission to the real estate agent, not the person buying the house. And the argument that's often put up and was put up to us in Select Committee was, well, you know, when the rental market is tight, the letting agency is in a way working for the tenant, not for the landlord, because it's so hard to find a property that it's in fact good for the tenant that the letting agency is doing that work. But that argument doesn't apply to when someone sells a house. Regardless of the housing market, it is the person who has engaged the professional agency, be it a real estate agent or a letting agency, that pays that commission. It's not the tenant or the purchaser who has engaged that professional organisation. So therefore, why should they be the ones to pay for it? And I would welcome the Minister's arguments on this matter, because it is a significant barrier to getting into the rental market. It is yet another thing you have to pay on top of the cost of moving, on top of the cost of an upfront bond, on top of the fact that rents are going to go up and have been going up. It might not seem like a lot to some members in this House, but having to pay another week's rent on top of all of that may well be the difference between someone being able to get into that property or not. Now, an interesting fact is we had a lot of real estate agents come along saying to us, well, they were annoyed because property managers and letting agents could charge letting fees, but they couldn't. And when we put it to them, well, would you be happy to just take it away from everyone. They said yes. What they wanted was a level playing field. They didn't want this as, the real estate agents didn't want it as a source of income. They wanted a level playing field. And the National Party agreed with that, and the Labour Party agreed with that there should be a level playing field. But the National Party's point of view was that, well, everyone should charge tenants letting fees, and the Labour Party and the Green Party, if I'm not speaking for them, but at Select Committee, their point of view was then no one should charge letting fees to the tenant. If a landlord wants to engage a property agency, a property management agency, or a letting, Mr Chair, thank you, Mr Chair, or a letting agency to market their property, then they should pay the cost of engaging that letting agency. It should not go to the tenant. So there is an SOP in my name which would make this change and prohibit the charge of letting fees to tenants. And I urge members of this House to support it. I think it is only fair that this SOP be passed into law. Mr Chair, the second issue that I want to talk about is another. It was actually an issue that started off as a private member's bill by my colleague Marianne Street. And this is around the issue of joint and several liability when there is damage to a property. And this issue arose out of a case in Dunedin where a student flat burnt down, and one tenant was responsible for the action that caused that, and the other tenants were not. In fact, they weren't there. They didn't know anything about it. In fact, they couldn't have stopped it because they knew nothing about it. But they were held liable. Now, we've heard that I believe 2 of those tenants who had nothing to do with it, who couldn't have stopped it even if they'd wanted to, were bankrupted as a result of the insurance company going after them to get back the money that they had to pay out to the landlord to fix that property. Now, this is a situation where clearly only the insurance company wins. And I want to be quite clear about this because I know that there tends to be a bit of mischief about trying to misrepresent what Labor believes on this. Absolutely, a landlord should be able to recoup damages caused to the property. But what Labor is saying is, why don't we make the person responsible, the one who is targeted for recouping that, rather than people who are not responsible? And it may well be that the response that Labor put up wasn't the best way of doing it, and the government thinks there's another way of achieving that, and we would definitely be open to those options. But I don't think anyone would think that it's fair that an insurance company gets 2 bites of the cherry by chasing after people who could not possibly have stopped an action happening, and you end up with young people at university bankrupted as a result of the actions of that company. And so this is a serious issue. The Minister has known about this issue for a long time. In fact, he dealt with it as opposition spokesperson for housing when he was in opposition when my colleague Marianne Street first brought that bill to the House as a private member's bill. He has had more than 18 months to deal with it as Minister. It's been many, many months, I think since September last year, since the Select Committee reported back on this bill. He's known about it for a long time, and I hope that he will be able to stand in this House and tell us why either he will not be addressing this issue, why he doesn't feel that it's a situation that needs to be addressed, or if he is prepared to address it, what he intends to do about that. So I'll save the other SOPs for further calls, Mr Chair, but certainly the issue of letting fees, which I think is a critical issue where I do not understand how the government could possibly say that it is unfair that the person who engages the letting company pays for it as opposed to the person who ends up renting the property, particularly in light of budget changes, Mr Chair, particularly in light of the hardship being faced. 30% of New Zealanders rent their properties and 80% of them have a combined household income, not personal, combined household income of under $50,000. These are not people who can easily absorb another couple of weeks' rent on top of everything else. And that's what makes the issue of letting fees so much more critical than perhaps it was even when Labor put forward a piece of legislation saying that we would prohibit the charging of letting fees to tenants. It is an issue of fairness, Mr Chair. It is an issue I don't see the government scrambling to make sure that in a tight housing market the real estate agents charge the vendor and not the seller for their properties. And it is difficult to comprehend why the government and why the Housing Minister feels it's necessary to whack another cost onto tenants who, in the current financial situation,